Well folks, we're going to be starting in on part 2 of the 4-wheel drive Gravely engine swap today. And the plan is to get this crank out of the block without having to pull the pistons and the connecting rods out. Because it ran well, it didn't smoke, I'd rather leave everything in so I don't disrupt the ring placement or anything like that. So we'll see if we can do it. If not, we'll just pull them out. It's not too big of a deal. But I started draining the oil on it earlier, so it's been sitting here for a while. It's some pretty bad stuff. There was some water that came out before the oil, and it's some really milky stuff. So more than likely when I ran it, there was some moisture in there and everything got mixed up. So we'll have to run some of the internal parts through the parts washer and get all the sludge cleaned out of it. And over the past couple weeks, I started looking around for another Gravely crank for a 450. Unfortunately, I didn't come up with anything. I was calling some places that had used Gravely parts up and down the East Coast. There was only one guy down south that had a 450 crank. Andy had a 450 crank in a parted out block for a CCK, but he wanted very unreasonable money for both of them. It was about, I think he was asking $500 for the crank and $500 for the crank in the block, not to mention the shipping to get it up here to New England. So pricing was way out of this world for what it was. It's just a crankshaft that's stepped down, and I just assume spend the money at the machine shop because it's going to be a fraction of that versus buying that and probably having to machine that crank too, because more than likely the journals will have to be done on it. But luckily enough, fellow Gravely guy Ralph Williams had an extra crank kicking around, so he was nice enough to mail it up to me so that way I can bring it to the machine shop, and what I'll have him do is check all the tolerances on this, and I'll have them match it to my crank so they'll machine mine the same as the one that Ralph sent up. So that way I know everything's right where it should be, and it saves me from having to measure everything off the back of the engine. Because this is the gear, like I showed you guys before, that has to go on there, but it has to be stepped accordingly because the gear is going to sit here, and then the stub on the end sits into the pilot bushing in the planetaries. So that'll work out pretty slick. But anyways, I'm going to set you folks up on a tripod and we're going to start tearing down this engine. Well, I suppose I should have taken the exhaust off first. I guess that would have been the smart thing to do. It's nice pulling apart something that's already been apart before. It comes apart pretty dang quick. Well, when Onan made these flywheels, they ended up tapping the holes in it for 5/8 bolts. And the puller that I have only goes up to 3/8, or the slots in it will only fit a 3/8 bolt. So with a little bit of modification, though you really can't see it, with my die grinder, I was able to get a 5/8 bolt to slide through. Because I just tried using a jack shaft bolt with the flywheel weight that goes onto it, which I figured it would work out pretty well, but this flywheel's pretty darn stuck on here too. So we're definitely going to need a formal puller to get this off with the 1/2-inch impact and the air on it. That's the beauty of a 1/2-inch impact. Made it a whole lot easier. So before I go any farther, I figured I'd show you folks this. If you remember when this was running, it was making a little bit of a chattering noise, or it sounded like something was dragging. Well, apparently there was enough rust built up on the stator and inside the flywheel magnet ring where everything was dragging on itself, because you can see there's a bunch of little shavings on the magnets. So the stator must have been dragging on the inside of it, and I could hear and feel it when I just spun the flywheel over as it is. But aside from being dirty, everything looks okay. And I know I touched upon this once in the first video, I think, but what I am going to do is get rid of this original Onan charging system. You can see they have the voltage regulator mounted down here on the oil pan, and it's only a 2-wire stator, just like the Kohler K-series stators are. So what I'm going to do is wire this like a Kohler K-series with the regular old voltage regulator that has the AC, and B+ prongs on it, 15 amp. Because I ended up doing this with somebody's Case 646 that came through here about a year or so ago, because their original Onan regulator was junk, and it actually worked out pretty slick, and it made it a little easier if it has to get replaced to find parts for. Alright, so I did skip ahead a little bit here. I got all the charging components and the electrical stuff off of here. I scraped some of the crap and stuff that was on the block off, that way it doesn't get into the engine. And that way I figure we can skip ahead to pulling apart the internals, because it's more interesting than pulling apart the stuff off the outside of the engine. Apparently this cover is going to put up a pretty good fight coming off of here, unfortunately. Pretty well stuck. Pretty good gasket to get it to stick that well. Well, the cover is a little nicked up from the pry bar, but nothing that won't seal. So the inside all looks pretty decent for the most part. So what I'm going to try to attempt to do is not pull the camshaft out of this engine, but I have to get the cam drive gear off of the crank before the crank can come out. And in order to do that, you either have to have a special puller or you have to make one. And since I've already done this once before, a couple of years ago, I ended up making a puller, which all it is a piece of 1/4-inch plate. There's a hole tapped in this gear 180 degrees off from each other. There's 2 of them. So all you do is you bolt that onto the gear like so, and then you take your jaw puller and you put it over it, you hook onto the plate, and you can pull the gear off. And that allows you to be able to pull the crankshaft through the face of the block, because they didn't make a hole big enough to get this gear through. So in order to do this, as I've just remembered, and I had to pull the plate off again, I have to pull the oil pump out of this. That way I can turn the plate sideways like so and get the puller on it this way, so I'm pulling where each screw hole is. That way I don't have to worry about torquing the plate and snapping the screws off in the gear. And as you can see, we already have some crap down in the pan that gets sucked up onto the strainer. So once again, that'll have to get cleaned up before it goes back in. There we go. Thought I was going to snap the heads of the bolts off for a minute. I know these things go on tight. And there you have it. That's what you got to do to get the little timing gear off of there. And now we can slide the crank through the block. And next I'm going to take off the oil pan. That way I can stand this block up on this cylinder here, and I can look in through the bottom and work on getting the connecting rods off of the crankshaft. Well, I don't know where this engine was sitting before it got here, and probably before the other guy had it too, but it's got some pretty nasty stuff in this oil pan. It's like trying to pick up swamp scum, really. It's that bad. Luckily there's a screen on the bottom of that thing to keep it from getting pulled up, but there's a fair amount of it in there. So without a doubt, that's going to have to get cleaned out. But now I can get to my connecting rods on the bottom of the crankshaft, which makes everything easy access. And I think I can flop one back and flop the other one the other way, and with any luck I can pull this through the back here. So we might as well get those loosened up. Well, I don't usually use air tools when taking apart internal engine components, but because I can't get enough torque on these and hold the block at the same time, I'm just going to pop them off with the 3/8 air. Makes it a little easier. Rod bearings have some wear, but nothing too significant, so I'm not going to bother changing those. I didn't hear anything knocking when I was running it. Well, I wasn't going to pull these pistons out, but I'm looking down inside of these cylinders, and on the back sides, there, like I said, there must have been a bunch of moisture in this engine, and it's rusted on the bottoms of the skirts, and where the piston goes down, the skirt of the piston goes down past it, it's going to be hitting the rust. So I'd much rather get that out of there if possible, so that way it's not wearing on the piston. And at least I'll be able to take a good look at the cylinders anyways while they're out. And hopefully this doesn't get more involved than what I want it to be. And now that the pistons are both out, last thing I have to do is pull the crank out. Just a matter of getting the bearing plate off, and should be able to slide it right through the back. And there you have it, folks. There's our crank. So I'll get the oil cleaned up here, put some of these tools away, and then we can take a closer look at this. And we're all disassembled, folks. That's everything pulled apart except for the camshaft out of the block. And like I was saying, as you can see, there's some pretty nasty stuff down inside that oil pan that had this engine had in it. So that's all gonna have to get cleaned out. The rest of these parts will all have to get ran through the parts washer, cleaned out, scraped out, all the old gaskets peeled off of them. I'm assuming this oil pump is still good. I'm hoping that that screen caught most of the crap. I might pull it apart. I think I have a shim kit left for one of these. If not, I can always buy it when I buy the gasket kit for this, which I still have to pick up. Get the heads cleaned up and all that stuff. And as for the internals, I left the rings just about where they were when I pulled everything apart, and they're pretty much still in the same spot. So aside from the rust in the cylinder, it's a good thing that I did pull these out, because as you can see, that's where the rings were when I removed them. The gaps are just over each other, which isn't good for compression or oil or anything like that, because when I had these heads off before I started filming, there was a little bit of oil pooled up in the bottom of the cylinder again. So either the rings aren't seating well because of the rust, which I wouldn't be surprised, or being that all the ring gaps are lined up. Although you wouldn't figure it would leak that much, but you do never know. And this is the other one. They were about that close. So I'm gonna have to clean these pistons up, take a look at the rings. Hopefully I don't have to re-ring it, because I'm sure that those are OEM Onan rings, and those aren't gonna be cheap. Crankshaft looks okay. There's no scoring on the journals or anything like that. And holding it up to the 450 crank, I measured it out, and everything's going to start getting machined right about here. And as you can see, the oil seal rides right about there. So I'm just going to have them make it look like this on the end, and that will be all set to go with this other crankshaft, and that can go into the engine. So I'll be bringing that down this week to get that down to the machine shop. So until then, I'll be getting all this stuff cleaned up, and then hopefully in a couple weeks I'll be back with part 3, and we can start getting this engine back together again. So anyways, folks, there you have it.